Let me just start by asking, because at the Energy Summit, you made a really fascinating observation that the great transition that needs to happen, that is just starting now, to a non-carbon powered economy, that the innovation for that will come from independent entrepreneurs or small-scale entrepreneurs. The larger companies will scale that up, buy up their innovations and scale it up. But the thinking, the innovation needs to come from the small scale or the independent thinker. So you obviously don't have much faith in all of the, one might say, narrative coming from the Fortune 500 these days about how big companies seem to be buying into this reality of climate change and the need to, seriously take on the COP goals.
Most of them, most of the large corporations that are doing something about this are using it for their own internal implementation. But in terms of innovating solutions, most of them don't actually have spare capacity to have an innovations department, or even if they do, it's looking at their own products, not at their own internal systems.
Okay.
So, and also some of this is based on my own experience. I went to see Volkswagen in 2008 to their headquarters and said to them that one of their biggest customers, which was who I was working with at the time, Deutsche Post, who had 59,000 vehicles on the road in Germany, wanted to move them all to electric. Please would Volkswagen create an electric version of their Caddy, which was the vehicle they were using, and that the board said that we could buy at least 5,000 as a starting point, and we'd like to move to all 59,000 being electric.
Okay.
And Volkswagen said, it's very complicated, it'll take too long, it's all new technology, and really 5,000 units isn't a big enough order.
Oh, okay.
Now, telling me that electric vehicles is a new concept and that it required a whole lot of new complicated stuff was really not quite true. Especially as the previous week we'd actually managed to get a truck out of the museum in Germany, which was one of Deutsche Post, German postal systems, 1938 electric delivery trucks.
Okay.
They had 2,500 electric delivery trucks in 1938 delivering the post in Germany. So telling me that this was a new technology was just rubbish. And that was 2008. 2007, Tesla brought their test car to my office for me to drive the Roadster, the original little one that was based on the Lotus.
Okay.
The next day, I took the Lotus donor car around Brands Hatch. It was the fastest lap I've ever done on anything, anywhere. And I could see that this technology was sorted. I mean, okay, the trim levels of that first car were a bit basic, but in terms of did it work, did it have range, did all the engines, all the motors work properly, it was all there and done.
Okay.
In 2008, we ran trials with electric truck, 9-ton carrying capacity electric trucks, delivering all of the F&B supplies to Heathrow Airport, run by DHL. 2-year trial, worked absolutely superbly, and actually after we did the sums, we worked out that it had about the same financial profile as a diesel vehicle.
Okay.
So the industry was very slow, and one of the reasons that the innovation isn't going to come out of those bigger companies is because there's so much vested interest, so much investment. I mean, the guy from Volkswagen said to me privately, when we build an engine plant, it's got a 10-year life expectancy for the plant that makes the engines. So you can't come to us halfway through that 10-year depreciation cycle and say you want to replace all the diesel engines with electrics. So everybody's really wrapped up in where we've got to. I mean, to be quite honest, it's taken us nearly 100 years to get to being completely dependent on fossil fuels.
Okay.
And it's going to take, apparently, only 2 decades for us to become independent of fossil fuels, if you follow the argument that we need to keep below 1.5 degrees. So how do you become independent of something that you become dependent on? I mean, we are utterly addicted to fossil fuels for really good reasons. It is the most energy dense form of energy that we could possibly get, and we have been very, very poor at using that energy density. So the average petrol car only converts 25% of the chemical energy into motion at the wheels.
Okay.
So for some reason, at some point, we all thought, okay, 75% inefficiency is acceptable. Whereas now the car companies are at least pushing up the fuel economy of the cars so that they can get up to maybe 30, 35%. Electric vehicles, close to 85 or 90% of the delivered energy turns into motion. So it's a lot better to move to these newer technologies. And if you want an example of where the innovation's coming from, just look at Tesla.
Okay.
I mean, that started as a small company. Yes, it got a load of grants, and now it's got a huge valuation.
Okay.
But in terms of production, it's still a relatively small business in terms of the car industry. But there have been lots and lots of other players that have come out that are not, the pioneers for the solar industry.
Yes.
Is not the electricity grid providers.
Okay.
These are small companies that are taking leaps and bounds because it requires a level of innovation and entrepreneurship to do these things that big vested interest companies just don't have. It's not that they don't want them, they just don't have the people to be able to do it.
Okay. So what is it that will be, or what is it with many of these smaller companies that are now emerging and that have emerged in the solar panel industry, with Tesla obviously being perhaps the most famous example, but is it sort of a younger generation of entrepreneurs that see the problem we're facing and are looking for solutions? They see market opportunities.
Entrepreneurs are always looking for the next big thing, and entrepreneurs wake up every morning thinking, why? Why is the world like this, and how can I make it a bit better? And they can't help themselves. And entrepreneurs have looked at this challenge and thought, well, this is something that I need to do for my children and my grandchildren. And if we're right, this is the world's biggest economic opportunity to reinvent the global economy in 2 decades with new technology. We've got to replace everything.
Okay.
Got to replace tables, chairs, manufacturing plants, buildings, vehicles, aircraft, everything has to change. And the logic behind not doing it doesn't seem to stack up. I haven't met anybody yet who says, actually, I don't want to save the planet.
Right.
I think I'm going to find another planet to go and live on. So the rationale and the argument's really compelling. The issue is that there's too many crazy people wrapped up in it all as well. So the majority of industry and sensible boards of sensible companies are not going to react well to threats of, well, if you don't do this, we're all going to run away. All of your employees are going to go on strike, or all of your kids will stop going to school, and all these things. That's not the way that change happens. Change needs to happen through rational reasons, through saying to people, okay, there is a really good imperative reason that you must follow a different strategy, but if you do so, you'll make more profit, your shareholders will do really well, you'll have a better long-term strategy, and as a board, you'll probably make your bonuses this year. And that's the sort of thing that has to drive those guys.
When will we reach that tipping point, do you think? When corporate boards really embrace that carbon neutral will be the driver of greater profit. And
it's funny because
it's hard to say, isn't it?
It's
right,
very difficult to predict when the tipping point will be.
Yeah.
But we are closer to it now than any time in the last 13 years that I've been involved in this. We're a long way away from it 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And in the last year, things have definitely changed. And the most recent Davos, whether or not you followed Greta Thunberg's version, which was we have to stop using fossil fuels tomorrow, and I don't mean the day after tomorrow, I mean literally tomorrow, because they're all inherently bad and it's all causing the death of the planet, or you follow President Trump's argument, which is there's a bunch of new technologies out there that are going to address all of this stuff, we just need to embrace the new technologies. Whichever argument you follow, the positive or the negative one, both of them were talking about it.
Okay.
And I've never seen this happen before, where it gets to the number one thing on the agenda of everybody who's attending Davos, which is the center for most business leaders and political decision makers around the world. It's the arch think tank is saying, you really need to do something about this, and here's a couple of solutions. One, we can completely turn our economy upside down and stop using fossil fuels, which isn't going to happen.
Right.
Or we can have a more positive, proactive approach and say we've got to find some entrepreneurs out there and we've got to encourage them and foster them and then adopt drastically all of these new issues.
Going back to the idea of entrepreneurship and your company, And you obviously started out as a small company. You're growing. You had an innovation. You patented it. Do you want to talk a little bit about just what got you into thinking about working in this field of developing non-carbon fuel?
Well, I'm probably not atypical of people getting into the sustainability space, in that I'd had a very successful career in the IT industry.
Okay.
I'd done 5 trade sales and 2 IPOs, and I got to the point where I needed to find something that was really important to get involved with rather than just making money.
Okay.
And with 3 children and a growing awareness that the planet really does need a completely different way of doing pretty much everything, I thought, well, this looks like an excellent opportunity.
Okay.
And there have been numbers put on it, but I mean, essentially, as I was saying earlier, we have to reinvent the global economy. Somebody asked last week at the conference, which particular economic model do you think we should follow in order to do this? And the only honest answer was not the current one. Because the current model that we have, where everybody is very embedded in what they decided to do 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and where everything is driven on constantly making more and making more profit and making more product and consuming more every single quarter in order to support corporate reporting, that isn't really going to work if we have to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels, if we have to reduce our carbon footprint. It's going to be very, very tricky to achieve all of those things at the same time and maintain the current economic model. On the other hand, I'm not arguing, as many people are doing, for redistribution of wealth and other sort of Marxist principles.
Sure.
I don't think this is an opportunity for everybody in the world to say we need to equal out the whole of society and we need to fix all of the other complex problems with society. I think this is an opportunity for capitalists to reinvent a bunch of capitalist economies, because pretty much everywhere in the world now runs on a capitalist theory.
Sure.
So coming back to our business, I looked at this as an opportunity and thought, well, what do I need to do? And I founded the Neutral Group at the end of 2006 to look at how to bridge the gap between the emergent new technologies that were going to come out to address climate change and the large corporates that needed to adopt them on a broad scale.
Okay.
And that's where we've sat for 13 years now, as a bridge between technologies. Some of them we've created, some of them we've adopted, some of them we've modified, and large global organizations that needed to adopt them. So with Neutral Fuels, we started out actually writing the sustainability strategy for 37 countries for McDonald's.
Okay.
And one of the things that came out of that consultancy project was a realization that they could be independent of fossil fuels if only they could convert all of their waste into biofuels.
Okay.
And McDonald's was great. They saw that this was a great opportunity to do some pioneering work, and they said to us, well, prove it. You've said all this stuff. Don't just be a standard consultant of telling me some stuff, and now I'd like you to prove it. Put your money where your mouth is and actually show me.
Okay.
So that's what we did.
Okay.
And then they said, well, now you've done our supply chain in the UAE, we now got to look at some of our other partners. So Del Monte delivers the fresh fruit and vegetables to the McDonald's restaurants, and so McDonald's asked them, can you join the program as well? Then they said, we've got a global partnership with Nestle, so we joined in with Nestle as well. And then that's allowed us to roll across the region into different countries, because they've all got pretty similar supply chains when it comes to this particular niche that we've targeted.
Okay.
And they've all got the same mentality, which is globally we have to do this. And if there's a local partner that's sensible and does a professional job of it, then why wouldn't we work with them?
So your focus is on essentially on the supply chain and on the transport sector of it, heavy transport, I assume.
Well,
Because that's where biofuels, like these advanced biofuels that we're talking about and that you produce, from vegetable substances, I assume. These are an answer, they fill in a niche in the sort of sustainability universe, which is this heavy transport, shipping, aviation, kind of those sectors that we can't reach with electrical power as well, or...
The industry and the innovation towards transportation seems to have focused electrics on passenger vehicles. There are some sort of sheer physics reasons why it's more difficult with electric trucks and electric buses and certainly electric ships, electric aircraft. I do think that with enough innovation and enough thinking, we'll probably crack those problems.
Okay.
But certainly today, there aren't a huge number of choices for all electric trucks, plug-in hybrid trucks. They're just not there. Whereas for cars, you've got a whole range of choices, and you can go out tomorrow and buy one, and they're just available. So when it comes to what the diesel engines are doing, they are the workhorses for most of the supply chain.
Sure.
We did start 13 years ago, and we were looking holistically at where we could make the most bang for our buck. And we did a lot of work on buildings.
Okay.
And we wrote original Green Buildings Code, and then we rolled that out for DHL, and then we applied some of those principles in Dubai, and then we applied some of those principles in McDonald's.
Okay.
We've done a lot of work on that, but it seemed to me that the world was catching up on that. And with LEED and with BREEAM and with some of the other standards, they were already realizing that, first of all, we had to retrofit the existing buildings that we had,
Yes.
and that new design needed to encompass a lot of those features. So I didn't need to do much there, apart from prove to people that you could save money by making these changes.
Okay.
So we did that, and we started looking at transportation. And transportation has been one of those sectors that really hasn't had that amount of focus. The governments have focused on it, and since 2003 in Europe, it's been mandated to blend biofuels in with regular fuel for every drop of diesel that's sold. That's a government mandate, and it's now in 64 countries. But when it comes to some of these other areas, I mean, you talk about the marine industry, the IMO regulations that have come out in January this year, pushing people towards a 500 parts per million sulfur diesel for their fuels, or a heavy fuel oil, whichever it is. Everybody got very excited and about the fact that the maritime industry was going to be using a clean fuel. It's not clean.
Right.
It's just slightly cleaner than the previous one.
Yes.
But, and I don't know, I'm a little bit cynical, but they describe it as a 0.5% sulfur fuel.
Okay.
In the road fleet, we describe that as a 500 parts per million, 5,000 parts per million fuel. Sorry, a 500 parts per million fuel.
Okay.
And the reason that I draw the distinction is that that fuel that has now been adopted as the clean fuel for ships was outlawed in 1993 in Europe as being too dirty.
Ah, interesting.
And the challenge that we have with both diesel and other fuel oils for the shipping industry is that there's a shortage of supply of any sort of really sustainable versions of that fuel, even for the road industry. And being able to move that into the maritime industry is a really big problem, because their consumption is huge.
Yes.
Both of those industries require similar feedstocks to produce sustainable versions of their fuel.
Okay.
There's not enough to fulfill the road industry's sustainable feedstocks.
Okay.
Even if you look at algae and hydrocracking and other sorts of policies. So the maritime industry isn't going to be able to adopt that unless they pay more, and of course they want to pay less because their average pricing is a lot lower. And now the aviation industry is saying they want to adopt biofuels as well. Well, those feedstocks are exactly the same short supply for aviation as they are for road and as they are for sea. You can't have three things out of one.
Okay.
So I think that the shame for aviation is that we really should be focusing more on hybrids and on electrics, because the horse has already left the stable when it comes to biofuels. That's already being consumed by the road industry.
Yes.
And although they will, next 2 decades, probably migrate to electrics, it's certainly going to take a long time for them to do that. And the maritime industry is there saying, well, can you give us some biofuels as well?
Yeah.
And we're coming up with maybe more alternatives for them. But the requirements of the aviation industry are so specific and so have to be so intrinsically safe with what they're doing that makes the fuel cost a lot more. And the sustainable biofuels that are being used for jet aviation, last time I read, was 6 times more expensive than regular fuel.
Wow.
So when somebody says they're running a flight on bio aviation fuel, they're not. They're running a very tiny percentage because economically it doesn't work at all at the moment.
So right now you're going to, with your firm Neutral Fuels, you're going to stay focused on heavy transport on roads.
We're focused on road and rail. That's where we think we can make the most impact. And coming back to something else that I've observed is that the big shock for the fossil fuels industry is that the raw materials to make sustainable fuels are not located in small pockets in small number of countries around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Those raw materials are located pretty evenly everywhere in the world where there are human beings.
Yes.
Which means that it doesn't make sense to aggregate all of your supply of raw materials and ship it halfway around the world to a huge production plant.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when the consumption needs to be back where it came from.
Yes.
So in common with solar and wind and hydropower and many of these other more sustainable forms of energy,
Mm-hmm.
the supply and the demand are in the same place.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it only makes sense to build
Yeah.
relatively small local conversion facilities and not ship everything halfway
Okay.
around the world. And that is a massive economic consequence to everybody.
Yeah. You have a theme or a motto in your company, local, local, local?
Yes,
It's,
it's basically, if the raw materials are local
yeah.
and the consumption of the finished product is local,
Mm-hmm.
why wouldn't you do the manufacturing local?
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what we do. So it's
Mhm.
local, local, local.
Okay. So this will be a massive disruption to the way the oil majors do business.
Yeah.
I mean, can we do it in 20 years?
It's going to be a real challenge. We're going to need a lot of innovation and a lot of
Yeah.
entrepreneurs to do it.
Yeah.
And we need trucks that are running maybe at 30% efficiency of chemical energy converted into motion. We need them to be running a lot more efficiently.
Mm.
We need drivers to be improved in their efficiency.
Okay.
When I was at Deutsche Post DHL, we did some studies of driver behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And a really good driver will use 30% less fuel than a really bad driver in a truck.
Okay. Interesting.
So train the drivers properly and you can get 30% fuel efficiency saving without really spending very much money. All you have to do is train the driver. You don't need to change the employee or change the truck.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of work done on aerodynamics of trucks, and we
Okay.
can get maybe 10% improvements by making the boxes that we see storming around the world with huge engines, make those a little bit more aerodynamic and look at how we can improve their efficiency. So
Okay.
those things all need to happen.
Yes.
But in parallel, we're going to have to change the mix of fuel that we put into those engines as well. And that's what we can do, and it's easy.
Okay. So I assume you have an R&D kind of component
Yeah.
within your business group, and that is that a primary focus then of your R&D right now? Is what the mix?
The main
should be in
focus
fuel?
that we've got at the moment is
Is
to
it?
source lower cost feedstocks that allow us to
Okay.
produce a similar high quality end product.
Okay, interesting.
And we've got a couple of really good contenders for doing that.
Uh-huh.
And they're relatively pioneering, and we will eventually file patent for it.
Okay,
Just to correct something that you said earlier,
sure.
we're not producing hydrogenated fuels and hydrocracking.
Oh, you're not? Okay.
No, we produce a plug-in fuel
Mhm.
using transesterification as our main conversion.
Okay.
And we are pretty unusual in that.
Uh-huh.
We're producing fuels that run 100% swap out with a regular diesel
I
in
see.
an unmodified vehicle and give exactly the same fuel consumption,
Okay.
except that it gives you about 50% less tailpipe emissions.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know of anybody else around the world that's really done that. And it's a particular combination of the chemistry that we've got, which we've obviously got some really good IP around the chemistry.
Sure.
The business model, which allows us to do what's been used everywhere else, which is waste segregation at source. So one of the challenges for the biofuels industry when you adopt a large factory model, a large refinery model, is you have to take feedstock from all over the place in large quantities in order to feed your big, hungry refinery.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like with the oil industry where you can say, okay, this week I'm going to be refining Saudi crude and I know exactly what the spec is. We're dealing with waste materials here.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a 5 million litre ship and fill it up full of waste cooking oil, it's going to have every permutation of vegetable and animal type in there.
Sure.
Which means your efficiency of conversion at the other end is poor in the refinery, and the end product has, well, the minimum characteristics that you could get out of a blend of feedstocks.
Okay.
we pick the feedstocks that we use, and because we can source them locally and we can source them specifically, we can use those to customize how our end fuel behaves.
Okay.
So
you're not producing HOV, as they call it?
no.
Okay. Say again the name of the
So
actual fuel
the chemical process is called transesterification.
Transesterification.
Yeah. And what we are producing is a fatty acid methyl ester,
Ah, okay.
which is called FAME. And
FAME, yes.
you will see internationally it's quoted as UCO-ME, or used cooking oil methyl ester, or FAME, or RME, which is rapeseed methyl ester, or PME, which is palm methyl ester, and we're not producing those.
Yes.
We're only producing from waste vegetable oils.
Okay.
We don't use animal fats, we don't use tallows, we only use vegetable oils. And the reason that we can segregate those sources is because we're sourcing them locally. We know exactly where they're coming from. When you run a large refinery operation, you're going to get a mixture of animal fats and vegetables and some palm and some other stuff in there. And this is part of the problem for people making sustainable fuels, is it's very difficult on a large refinery level to make sure that you haven't contributed to deforestation somewhere in Indonesia and Malaysia with your feedstocks, because you're probably not sure where all the feedstocks came from.
That is an enormous problem, I would assume. You're focused on waste products. What is your thought about cellulosic feedstock, just in general? I mean, is it feasible to find greater, to expand the sourcing of the feedstock, which is a problem you mentioned? Are we going to need to do more of this kind of agriculture?
In my world, definitely not. We can't feed everyone on the planet as it is, and if we sacrifice arable land to grow crops to make fuel, we must be idiots.
Okay.
Certainly, ethically, I couldn't support doing that. We shouldn't be farming more of this land anyway. We should be putting it down to trees. Okay. But if we've got to feed everybody, we have to focus our farming lands on feeding people, not on growing crops to make fuel. So we've definitely, as a company, taken that decision a long, long time ago.
Okay.
But there's plenty of waste stocks out there. We are incredibly wasteful as a species, and so much of what we produce in our daily lives is just waste, and we don't do anything with it. We regard it as waste. We flush it down the toilet, we bury it in the desert, we bury it in landfills all over the world. That stuff pretty much all has the right components in order to be made into fuels, because if you just think about it, most fossil fuels are simply hydrocarbons, so they're hydrogen and carbon atoms and a few other little things on the side, maybe a little bit of oxygen, but they are made out of the same building blocks as all of our waste, our food waste, our human waste. Everything is composed of the same atoms. Yeah. Those are all we need in order to make fuel. And there's been some very exciting work done to make fuel, hydrocarbon, decent length, 16, 18 carbon chain length hydrocarbons from water and air. You can do it, it's just ridiculously expensive. But if you start with raw materials that already have got maybe 24 carbons in their chain, or 18, or even 6, you can turn that into a liquid fuel that we can use in a truck fairly easily. Okay. The thing is to focus on where's the best source of that. And that's what we've been doing.
How many trucks are on the road right now are using your fuel?
I have no idea. Thousands and thousands and thousands.
Okay. All in the Middle East?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We're doing it. I mean, just to give you an indication, this morning is a regular school day. There's about 500 school buses in Dubai that are running on our fuel. Okay. We'd like that to be a few more, but just on any regular day, it'll be thousands and thousands.
Because your fuel is equally substitutable with, let's say, petrol.
You can run on 100% of our fuel one day, fossil fuel the next day, 100% our fuel the next day, and the engine won't notice the difference. It'll give you the same fuel consumption. Our biofuel will actually make the engine last a bit longer because it's more slippery. It has a higher lubricity, has a higher cetane content, so it's actually got slightly more power. all of the things that you read on Google as being wrong with biofuels, we fixed 8 years ago.
Okay. Fantastic. How are we doing on time? Oh. Let me talk a little bit about your hometown now, which is Dubai. And I know you've been thinking about Dubai and its environmental ambitions. Dubai is obviously a city that likes to be praised for being, a little bombastic, a little kind of on the cutting edge of what's going on in the world. And so the leadership here has really adopted sustainability as a motif. And they're talking about 75% of energy from clean carbon sources, carbon neutral by the year 2050, which is 30 years from now. Can Dubai get there?
I think we'll beat the target.
Okay. Okay, and we got to talk about the three main areas, which are power, transportation, where you're heavily involved, and of course, then sort of end uses, buildings, I think, are the big one. So power, buildings, and transportation.
Well, when it comes to buildings, most of it is electricity for air conditioning. So
yes.
When it comes to the built environment, it's not that hard to see how we would get there.
Okay.
We live in a nicely sunny country. We've come up with some of the world's biggest solar projects, and literally the road that runs outside our office, Sakim, you drive up there about 15 kilometers and you have the world's biggest solar farm.
Yes.
MBR. And the next one, the next phase of that is about 10 times bigger.
Oh, so, really? In Dubai?
Yes.
Are they going to build it here in Dubai?
Yes, absolutely.
Do they have enough room?
We've got plenty of space. And
it's a small emirate.
Well, the lovely thing about it is that where it's being built was actually a sort of natural lake bed originally, a million years ago. So it's actually already flat.
Okay.
So that building it out is relatively straightforward. We've got a concentrated solar thermal system going in there at the moment that'll go live, I think, next year.
Okay.
And it's not that hard to imagine how we would do it. And the last time I read about this, the cost of electricity it's going to be producing was sitting at around 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Now I'm at the moment paying about 10 US cents a kilowatt hour for my electricity. So the solar is going to be considerably cheaper. If it's cheaper and you can build it, then why wouldn't we adopt it?
Yes.
Especially as that solves many of the problems. Certainly, I mean, all of our metro system here is it's driverless and it's 100% electric. So we can transport people around using our metro system. I'm one of the few Tesla drivers here, but we have our own branch of Tesla sitting here selling as fast as they can. Their problem is actually, please can you make some more in the States and in China, because they're sold out 6 months in advance of everything that they can bring into the country. So the problem here is
Dubai
more
is
about...
a big, great market for Tesla.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, especially the government's supporting it as well. So we get free car parking if you drive electric, get free road tax and everything. So it's trying to encourage that. When it comes to the commercial vehicles, we're a little bit slower on that. We've been working now here for nearly 10 years. And we've certainly had fantastic government support. But there is a very cautious, I mean, it may seem crazy to talk about cautious in Dubai, but they don't want to implement any policies that are going to completely decimate the economy.
Sure.
So you've got to try and balance the two things.
Yeah.
But I do think in the next couple of years, you're going to see some more pioneering adoptions of policy from government in the biofuel space. Last week, we won an award from the Ministry of Climate Change as their best innovation for 2020.
Yes.
And to get the Ministry of the United Arab Emirates to adopt something which is directly contra to fossil fuels, it's quite a big deal. When we opened up in Bahrain, that was the first time anybody had been able to get a biofuels license in Bahrain. And we're constantly pioneering these things, but it's getting easier.
Yes.
Just before Christmas last year, we shipped our first shipment of biofuels into Saudi Arabia.
Really?
And if you'd told me 10 years ago that we would be supplying biofuel into Saudi Arabia as opposed to producing it in country, I'd have said you were mad. There's no way anybody's going to do that. But The whole attitude is changing in the Middle East. I think there is a considerable intelligence in the leadership that we're blessed with petrodollars today. We all know that that's going to change in the future. Nobody's quite sure how fast and how it's going to change. But if we've got cash today, we have to invest that in our future because it's just the sensible thing to do. And luckily, in most of these economies, there's not that sense of profligate waste that existed in the 1980s or whatever. We're not talking about leadership here going out and buying gold-plated Rolls Royces anymore or doing any of that sort of stuff which all got the headlines. They're all saying we want to plan for the future of our people. And the people like living in a cleaner environment with better air quality, with cheaper solar power. And if you're making people happy, and happy isn't just an arbitrary notion. I mean, happy is about more content and better view of the future and better quality of life. If you're doing all of those things and it's sustainable at the same time, then we really are in a position to lead the world. The reason I chose to live here is because I totally agree with the leadership's attitude and what they're doing.
Okay.
It's so pioneering. And they're not shy to ask either. If you're an expert in a particular subject area, they will ask you to come for a quiet conversation and say, what do you think about this or what do you think about that? We never discuss what we discuss publicly,
Sure.
but they take the input, think about it, come up with policies that really work.
Okay. So for Dubai, keep moving forward on electrification, solar power.
Yeah.
Continue with EVs and just building efficiency. I would assume building efficiency is a key part of it.
We also have a nuclear program, so our nuclear
yeah.
reactor will go live next year.
Yes,
the
in Abu
first
Dhabi.
one,
Yeah.
and that's connected to the grid,
Okay.
so that will provide baseload power at night and the rest of the time. So there's a good chance that we'll actually have way more than we need, I think. And so in terms of can we get there by 2030 or 2040, I think we will do very, very well.
Okay.
I think it's tougher in other places. But the UAE is blessed with having sun and it's got some wind, which we haven't actually taken advantage of yet, but we will do.
Okay.
The ability to have nuclear because we're a stable economy is a good idea as well. And I see a lot of interesting challenges going on. I don't know if you saw from ADNOC last week, they announced they're going to reduce the carbon intensity of their own products by 25%. And the fact that you've got one of the world's largest oil producers actually making statements about carbon intensity and reducing it is also good. And they've got the muscle and the will to do something. And under Dr. Sultan, you've got really pioneering leadership.
Okay.
I mean, he spent, I don't know how many years, but certainly to my knowledge, nearly 10 years as chairman of Mazda, looking at all the sustainable technologies that we had in the world.
Yeah.
And now he's also leading ADNOC with the same sort of understanding of these technologies. It's fantastic.
Okay. Let me just kind of close it out by going back to your company and just saying, so 2020s are going to be a critical decade. And I think you really highlighted that. The next decade will make us or break us on climate change and meeting the goals of Paris. Where do you see your company moving in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the technologies you adopt or continue to advance with and the markets you enter into?
So I'm building $1 billion biodiesel business.
Okay.
And between now and the end of this decade, I will have done that. I think it's necessary to do it because in these markets that we're in, it's difficult. You have to work well with the governments. You have to be able to persuade people that this is something positive that they need to do. It's getting easier to do that, but certainly you've got to have a diplomatic way of working, which is not traditional for entrepreneurs. You can't just storm into these places.
Yes.
But it's absolutely necessary that we do it. The market requires it, and indeed increasingly the market's calling for it. So I think we'll be able to do that. I think we're going to be operating eventually in 50 cities.
Okay.
And we will have the ability in each of those 50 cities to source their own local waste and locally convert it into local fuel that they're going to use locally.
Okay.
That's our plan.
Okay.
It's not very complicated.
Yes.
It just requires a fair amount of capital and the goodwill and support of the leadership in those countries.
Okay.
But within 4 hours flying time of here, we've got over 100 cities with more than 1 million people. And each one of those is a candidate for us.
Okay.
We've got a hot list of about 20 at the moment.
Okay.
But I'm sure over the next decade, some of those will drop off and some more will be added to it.
Mm-hmm. Irina kind of pointed out that there has been a falling off in investment in biofuels.
I haven't seen it.
Okay, you have not seen it. Okay, interesting.
I've seen a lot of realization that mimicking the refinery model with huge refineries, the way we did with fossil fuels,
mm-hmm.
and trying to run biofuels through the same model
mm-hmm.
doesn't work.
Okay.
And there was some changes a year, 18 months ago, where the European Union had been trying to block Argentina and Indonesia from bringing their fuel into the European market to protect the European biofuels manufacturers.
Okay.
And when they lost that ruling in court, the next day the German guys shut down and the French guys halved production.
Mm.
So there are global economic, macroeconomic factors at play,
Mm.
all to do with the wrong model.
Right.
You know, Argentina does have the ability to produce lots and lots of reasonably low cost, good quality biofuel, the same with Indonesia. But look at the feedstocks. You've got to be wondering, why are they being able to do that? Well, in some cases it's because they've got a lot of deforestation going on.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the international large refineries of biofuels are only operating at 10 or 20% capacity.
Okay.
That tells you there's something wrong with the model.
Yes. Okay.
So from our perspective, we just think that they should reevaluate the model.
Mm-hmm.
But while they're doing that, we'll just be out proving that we're right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you do offer a lesson for the biofuels industry going forward, just in the experience of your company and your operations.
I think so. I mean, if you look at the history of biofuels manufacturers in the States or in Europe, they go bust every 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
We're now 10 years into this and we're nicely profitable. Thank you.
Okay. Karl, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
It's been a very interesting
Really good to be.
conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So,
Cheers.